the response of Marine Le Pen's supporters is exactly the same as the response of Adolf Hitler's supporters in 1931 or Donald Trump's supporters in 2023. Just to be clear, I'm not drawing yet direct analogies between all of those characters, but it's the fact of a powerful person using the law to create a sense of victimhood and enhance their political power is tried and tested. Look, they're ganging up on me, the establishment is against me, it'll be the same thing.
That's the international criminal barrister Philippe Sands talking about Marine Le Pen's conviction and what it could mean for her political future. The French far-right leader has been handed a 4-year sentence for embezzlement. Crucially, she's now barred from running for public office for 5 years, which means she can't stand in the French presidential elections in 2027. So, is this the end of Le Pen's political career, or is it the beginning of the French far-right in power? Welcome to the Newsagents. Well, joining us now for his very first interview on the brand new book, 38 Londres Street, is Philippe Sands. He's an international barrister, human rights barrister. We're going to be discussing lawfare. We're going to be discussing impunity. We're going to be discussing that complicated clash between politics and the law. What is extraordinary is we're talking on a day where in France the courts have just decided that Marine Le Pen, the leader of the far-right Rassemblement National party, has committed fraud, embezzlement, and they have sentenced her to 4 years in prison. They have forbidden her for running for the presidency in 2027. She's going to be essentially barred from standing for public office for 5 years. I mean, what does that judgment tell you about the relationship now between the law and politics? Is it the right one?
The judgment takes me right back to the late 1920s and the early 1930s. Londres Street is the third in a trilogy that started with a book called East-West Street. One of the main characters in East-West Street is a man called Hans Frank. Hans Frank was Adolf Hitler's personal lawyer from 1928 to 1933, litigated all the cases that Hitler lost, and Hitler used the defeats to turn around his political campaign. And that playbook was, of course, followed by Mr. Trump. Lots of litigation against him. Look, they're ganging up on me, the establishment is against me. And as I saw, and I'm half French, my mum's French, I've followed all the French press, I've been watching the news this morning, it'll be the same thing. I'm a victim, the establishment has ganged up against me, and the fear has to be that it will have precisely the opposite effect that it was intended to have. I asked myself the question, what would I do if I had been one of those judges? They've got to apply the law, they've got sentencing guidelines. What do? They're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. But the upshot, I suspect, will be was that it will enhance her political currency, it will make her stronger, she'll be able to claim she's a victim, just as Mr. Trump did, just as Mr. Hitler did, and on it goes.
Do you think that the prosecutors overplayed their hands? I mean, would it have been better to say, we know what the law says and we know what the sentencing says, but we can see how this is playing into the far right?
It's really tough as a prosecutor. I mean, embezzlement is a pretty serious crime. And if it were to happen here, and a director of public prosecutions were to say, actually, I'm going to go for something else, or I'm not going to really push it because the consequences of my doing this will be to create political unrest or a political decision that I'm unhappy with, that person would be slammed. So,
except her supporters say that that's exactly what happened with the IMF's Christine Lagarde, where there was also a question of misappropriated funds and she didn't face prison and she didn't even get a criminal record.
So I don't know enough about the facts of that case. If that's true, that would be seriously problematic. And if there is evidence that the prosecutors in this case chose a particular path motivated by extra-legal things, that's a problem.
Extra-legal means stuff that is outside
political stuff. Using your political opposition to someone to attack them. But of course, the response of Marine Le Pen's supporters is exactly the same as the response of Adolf Hitler's supporters in 1931 or Donald Trump's supporters in 2023. Just to be clear, I'm not drawing yet direct analogies between all of those characters, but it's the fact of a powerful person using the law to create a sense of victimhood and enhance their political power is tried and tested and very successful. And if I were advising Marine Le Pen, I'd say, I've been victimised. Look, they treated someone else differently. I don't know if that's what happened, but that's exactly what I do as a strategy.
And do you think that there was a way round this that would have been cleverer?
I don't know enough about French law. I'm qualified in English law. I would be surprised if the French prosecutors were not acutely aware of the political consequences of what they were embarking on, or that the judges were not acutely aware. And so it may well be that there were other means. But let's not forget, she's not alone in having been prosecuted. There are many others who have been prosecuted and indicted and convicted. And so it's part of a group exercise.
I mean, all it probably means is that even if she can't stand, that the force of anger helps Jordan Bardella, who stands in her place, right?
I mean, that's one scenario. The other scenario, of course, there's always appeals. And so now what we have is the spectacle, presumably, again, I'm not an expert on French law, of a never-ending series of appeals, which keeps the issue in the news, which keeps it bubbling along, which keeps her supporters incredibly agitated on the theme of victimhood. And it's a sort of no-win situation for those who are simply trying to apply the rule of law.
On the theme of victimhood, Donald Trump has now said, I think twice in the last 24 hours, that the idea of a third term is not out of the question. Said in an interview on NBC yesterday, repeated it to journalists on Air Force One. Do you now think we're at a place where the politics of America is basically ripping up the Constitution?
I'd say right now in the United States there are two people who really matter. John Roberts and Amy Coney Barrett. The two justices on the Supreme Court, Roberts is the Chief Justice, who will determine how the Constitution is to be interpreted or applied. Going backwards a tad, let us not forget that part of the rationale for what Mr. Trump is doing right now, and he's going very, very far in his interpretation of the Constitution, is a ruling of July last year of the Supreme Court that a former president has a presumptive immunity in relation to all official acts. Now, this is exactly the same issue that the House of Lords judges had to decide in relation to the Pinochet case. And they said there is no immunity where the official act is an international crime, in part because no international crime can ever be an official act.
I mean, this went back to the attempted insurrection on January the 6th and whether Trump could be held responsible for that.
Exactly.
And the court essentially deemed that he had immunity whilst in office for things that were related to the presidential role.
Official acts.
Yeah.
But what's troubling for someone like me dealing with issues of justice is they didn't have any carve-out. They didn't say immunity definitely doesn't apply if Mr. Trump orders genocide or torture or people to be disappeared. And let's not forget, people are now being taken off the streets of the United States. Books are being banned, and the president has said he interprets the Constitution as possibly allowing to have a third term. Now, there's a constitutional provision which says no one may serve for more than 2 terms of office. So ultimately, this issue is going to go to the Supreme Court, and that is going to turn not on the 3 liberal judges, not on the 3 uber-conservative judges, but in particular on 2 judges who've shown themselves to be open. And the judge to really look at is John Roberts. He's the president of the Supreme Court. Is he really going to want his reputation forever to be the one who opened the door to autocracy in the United States? So up to this point, the courts have been doing, I think, a pretty good job. Under tough circumstances, Congress is now talking about hearings for judges who vote against Mr. Trump's executive orders and various other things. You've seen that the executive orders are targeting lawyers and law firms, something that has never happened before in the United States. We're in uncharted waters. I've just come back from 2 weeks in the United States, and I have to tell you, a lot of really serious and sensible people are saying they don't think there are going to be midterms in 2 years' time. So
Midterm elections.
Midterm elections, the elections for Congress and the whole of the House of Representatives and 1/3 of the members of the Senate are up every 2 years. Those are due to be held in November 2026. I heard a lot of people, constitutional scholars, constitutional lawyers, professors, politicians, saying we are beginning to doubt there's going to be a midterm.
Oh, on what basis?
National
Who's saying
emergency.
that?
National emergency. And he declares a national emergency, and on that basis they're being invaded by foreigners. Maybe there's some conflict about Greenland or Panama or Ukraine blows up, and he declares a national emergency and the elections are postponed. I mean, it's very interesting. It's not about to happen because, as you probably know, people haven't really picked up on this. He had nominated a woman called Elise Stefanik to be the ambassador at the United Nations, and they've just pulled that nomination because she's a member of the House of Representatives in Congress. They're worried about a by-election in New York, which they might lose, they've already got a tiny majority. So they've got to preserve their majority until, presumably, at some point they say the situation is so grave facing the United States, we postpone the elections. Now, I'm not saying that is going to happen, but it was shocking to hear reasonable, sensible people talking about this as a possibility. And of course, it's exactly what Mr. Pinochet did. I mean, this is part of the anxiety that I have, is having spent years immersed in looking at how Pinochet, immediately after September the 11th, 1973, went about firing the top generals, firing the top people in the civil service, firing mayors, banning books, exactly taking people off the streets. You begin to get a sense of history repeating itself.
You keep on talking about Pinochet and Hitler and Trump in the same breath. I know you're making a differentiation, but do you see them all as using the same playbook, essentially?
The playbook is essentially the same. I mean, if you look at what's happening now in the United States, books are being banned, people are being taken off the streets, people are worrying about travelling to the United States because of concerns they may be interfered with in some way. People are being attacked for doing the normal things they do. I'm thinking here of the lawyers, where they're targeting entire law firms because one former lawyer acted in one case against Mr. Trump many years ago. And what you pick up, and this I felt tangibly myself, is a climate of fear. People are frightened. And when people are frightened, they limit what they say, they limit what they do, they limit where they go, and that is now palpable right now.
Philippe, just hold it there. Well, in a moment, we'll be hearing the extraordinary story of how he tracked a Nazi war criminal from Germany to the Pinochet regime in Chile, where he continued with a programme of state-sponsored killing. All that to come. This extraordinary book that has essentially tracked an SS commander from Nazi Germany to Chile, where, through your discovery, he basically carries on doing a similar type of work, this time for Pinochet.
Yes, you could not invent it. We know that lots of Nazis made their way along what was called the Rat Line and made it to South America. What's never been known before is whether any of them were involved in the work of the dictatorships in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Uruguay and other places. And I got a hunch when I was researching my book, The Rat Line, when I got access to a private archive, found a letter from a guy in Damascus, Syria, to someone in Italy. The writer of the letter was called Walter Rauff. I didn't know who he was. Turned out that he was the man who operated all the mobile gas vans for Himmler and for Reinhard Heydrich in 41 and 42, hunted after the war.
The gas vans, let's spell this out, where Jews were exterminated in the Second World War.
Little vans constructed to hold about 50 people and using the exhaust fumes to kill them. Jews, Poles, across the whole of Central and Eastern Europe occupied by the Nazis. Probably over 1 million people exterminated before they created the large industrial gas chambers, Auschwitz and Treblinka and so on and so
Ralph
forth.
was behind this, I don't know what you call it,
industrialisation. He ran
technology.
the vans.
Yeah.
I mean, a really rather unpleasant, rather nasty individual who escapes. makes his way to... So I have this letter. Who is he? I'm a litigator. I like to follow the evidence, a bit like you, investigations, so on and so forth. Who is this guy? Starts off in Syria, makes his way to Ecuador, moves in there with his wife and his 2 kids, settles permanently until he and his wife Edith meet a charming Chilean couple who say, you're in the wrong country, you should be in Chile, we like people like you, we have a big German community. They move to Chile in 1958, settle in the southernmost town in the world, Punta Arenas in Patagonia, written about in Bruce Chatwin's wonderful book. And then in 1963 there's an effort to extradite him to West Germany to stand trial for genocide and crimes against humanity because of the mobile gas vans. That falls through. He goes back to Punta Arenas, resumes his work as the manager of a king crab cannery for 10 years, and then on September the 11th, 1973, miracle of miracles, his friend from Quito, Ecuador, becomes president of Chile because it is none other than Augusto Pinochet.
So there's the overthrow. Pinochet comes to power and he suddenly realises he's in with a real chance here. Not just escaping justice in Germany, but becoming part of the very infrastructure of the Chilean government.
His life totally changes instantly. He writes to his sister in West Germany and says, now I'm like a protected monument. And it was a hunch that began with conversations, maybe like you. The people I like to talk to find out about people is taxi drivers. They tend to have a sense of what's going on. They all knew about Walter Rauff. They all said he worked for Pinochet. But I couldn't find any hard evidence. I don't want rumour. I don't want allegation. I want evidence. There are no documents, incidentally, from that period because the Chileans learnt from the Germans, the Pinochet era. The leaders destroyed all the archives when they began to get into trouble. So it's all talking to witnesses. But my hunch was he worked for Pinochet, Rauff worked for Pinochet, and it took 6 years to track down a group of individuals, one of whom alleged he had been personally interrogated by Walter Rauff in the torture centre at number 38 Londres Street, hence the title of the book. That was one piece of evidence. I sort of wanted corroboration. I was then introduced to some former secret agents for Pinochet's intelligence service, the notorious DINA, and I showed one of them a series of photographs, 4 photographs, 1, 2, 3, 4. One of them, incidentally, was of Eric Morecambe because he wore very similar glasses. The English comedian wore very similar glasses to Walter Rauff. He said, no, yes, this one I know. I don't know his name, but this one I know. How do you know him? I know him because he was always at the headquarters of the DINA. What was his role? He worked for the fish company. And that opened the door.
The fish company ends up being part of a front for disposing of Pinochet's political enemies. And Rauff is at the centre of that.
You know, sometimes, you're very experienced in this, you're talking with someone and someone says something to you and you hear much of what they say, but you don't hear, or it doesn't click with everything. But the man who had told me he'd been interrogated at Londres 38, Leon Gomez, also described to me that he would be transported to and from the torture centre in a refrigerated van from the Pesquera Arauco. I'd never heard of the company. I didn't think about refrigerated vans. I just passed on it. Then the former DINA agent tells me, yes, Rauff was associated with the Pesquera Arauco. And I put 2 and 2 together. What do I learn? The Pesquera Arauco was a long-established fishing company, hake, mostly on the Pacific coast. And the reason it was acquired by Pinochet and Manuel Contreras, his right-hand man, was that they had just acquired a fleet of 310 C10 Chevrolet refrigerated vans. And it turns out those vans were used to transport detainees and then to disappear detainees.
So you heard the word van, and somewhere in your head you're connecting the Rauff of Nazi Germany and the gassing vans,
yes,
with the transportation of Chilean political prisoners.
Yes, I almost could not believe it. But interestingly, and this is where life and literature intersect, as you know, you've read the book, there is this a newspaper article written by one of Chile's most famous poets, Pablo Neruda, who will be known to many of your listeners, mostly for romantic poetry, but when Ralph was not extradited to West Germany, Neruda was furious, and in 1965 he writes an article castigating the legal system of Chile for refusing to extradite Ralph back to West Germany for trial for genocide. And then he goes on about Ralph and says, this man really knows about vans. Now, I only came across that after I had made the other discoveries, but one of the things you sort of learn in life is that often it is the writers of literature and fiction and poetry who somehow pick up points of connection. Incidentally, the first time I ever read about Walter Ralph was when I was 19, and a book came out while I was at university by an English writer called Bruce Chatwin called In Patagonia, which many people, it was a sort of cult book in the late 70s and the early 80s. And chapter 96 of In Patagonia is devoted to Walter Ralph. There is a man in Punta Arenas, sings German leader and dreams of this. So these connections that we know about in life are fascinating.
It's an absolutely frightening, I mean, it's a jaw-dropping story, and it becomes part of a bigger narrative that you're telling about a story that I remember covering well when I'd first started sort of being a journalist in the UK at Sky News, which was the arrest of Pinochet. And none of us could believe it because Pinochet had stopped being the leader of Chile. He'd come to the UK for medical help. And suddenly there was this authorisation to detain him and say, we're going to charge him with war crimes. And so you describe the complicated system whereby so much changes, but in the end, under the Thatcher government, no, he never stands trial in the UK.
Well, you couldn't believe it, as I couldn't believe it, because it had never happened before in human history that a former head of state in one country is arrested in another country for international crimes. It's called universal jurisdiction. It came on a request for his arrest from a Spanish judge, Balthazar Garzon, who, of course, has become very famous. I became involved in the proceedings, ultimately against Augusto Pinochet. There was a moment where Mr. Pinochet wanted to hire me to argue that he was immune from the jurisdiction of the English courts. And the heart of the case was immunity, which is very much in the news right now. US Supreme Court judgment of a few months ago on President Trump's immunity as a former president, the claims of immunity of Mr. Putin, of Mr. Netanyahu. These are all related issues. But the English courts had to decide for the first time, does a former head of state have a right to claim immunity where international crimes are committed, even if no British person is involved? And the House of Lords ruled in successive judgments. It is complicated, and I apologise in advance to the readers for the complication. There's just no way of simplifying it. They rule that no, he has no entitlement to immunity. And then what happens is the matter gets pushed into the inbox of the then Home Secretary, Jack Straw, who has to decide what to do with him. And initially he says, no, I'm going to send him to Madrid until a deal is done.
It's such an interesting subject for all of us covering news right now, which is this clash between the law and politics. And ultimately, I think what you're telling us is that politics wins, right? I mean, the rule of law is subservient to the politics of the day. Is that fair?
Look, it's very complicated, and actually I think reasonable people can have a different view as to whether Pinochet should have gone to Madrid, where he would have faced trial, or gone to Chile. Jack Straw, in the end, decides he accepts the medical evidence that Pinochet is unfit to stand trial and decides to allow him to return to Chile. We had all had the hunch that there was something else going on. And what I've now managed to do in conversations with the head of the Chilean delegation, Christian Tolosa, and the person he negotiated with on the British side, the hugely impressive Jonathan Powell, with whom I had lengthy conversations, that in fact a deal was done. And the deal was that they would decide Pinochet was unfit for trial. He would return to Chile, and then he would lose his immunity in Chile. There'd been no proceedings in Chile, not against him, not against anyone, in relation to the crimes of his era. He goes back, the immunity is lifted, and proceedings begin not only against him, but against many, many other people. The drama of the book turns on the circumstances in which the Chileans were able to prove to the British his immunity would be removed once he got back to Chile. But coming to the heart of your question, it is true that Pinochet himself, in the end, never stood trial in a court of law. He died in 2006, indicted, under house arrest, not able to walk the streets of his own country. So it's not total impunity. On the other hand, his return unleashed a whole raft of cases, criminal cases, and many dozens of people, senior people, are now in prison still today for crimes committed as a consequence of that arrangement. And people are divided. Some people in Chile think it is outrageous that he didn't go to Spain to face justice himself. Others say, no, that was a price worth paying. It was a fragile democracy, and it opened the door for justice for others. So it's a cup half full type of scenario.
Philip, look, there will be people saying, Philippe Sands, liberal, lefty, human rights lawyer, would say that, wouldn't you? You've been a legal advisor to the Mauritian government. We haven't spoken since the Chagos deal was announced by Keir Starmer. And there'll be lots of people here saying, hang on a second, just spell out why are we giving billions of pounds to the Mauritian government to give up land? Just help us understand that. That makes no sense at all.
That's one thing I would love to do, but until the arrangement is done, I have not done any interviews on that issue, and please forgive me.
But do you understand the nervousness that people will have, kind of going, I don't understand why are we paying to give up land sovereignty?
What I'll say is this: go back to a decision of February 2019 of the International Court of Justice, which said in terms, the United Kingdom does not have sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago. It is and has always been part of Mauritius. If you just look at the history of the litigation on that case, 28 international judges have had a chance to express a view as to who has sovereignty over the Chagos archipelago. Mm-hmm. Not one has supported a British claim to sovereignty, even the British and American judges.
But still paying for it.
Let's do it step by step.
Yeah.
The first step is who has sovereignty. Now, the law is crystal clear. The Foreign Office lawyers recognise it's crystal clear. So it's not about handing sovereignty back, it's about recognising the sovereignty of Mauritius over that particular area. Now, there is a hugely significant military base there, and the position of successive Mauritian governments has been that military base continues to operate as it always has. And the consequence of that is you have to work out an arrangement for the conditions under which that base is going to operate. Now, on the one hand, you've got a situation in which the United Kingdom has been illegally occupying the territory of Mauritius for more than 50 years. You've got to deal with that reality. And then you've got to deal with the reality going forward. And actually, I suspect that when the agreement becomes public, people will say, what's the fuss about? The headlines bear no relation to the reality of what is actually happening.
Except critics of the deal, this, are saying you're Keir's pal. You're both from the same lawyer class. You were brought in to sort of, help him see the light, and you've been quite a big influence on this.
I've been no influence on Keir Starmer. I haven't seen him since the election. We have never talked about the Chagos archipelago, and the reason for that is incredibly simple. I'm a member of the English bar. He is a politician. He could have become Prime Minister. I am acutely aware that the moment I seek to use any of my professional activity in a way that's inappropriate, I'm going to be slaughtered and he's going to be slaughtered. So I have never done such a thing, and I would never do such a thing. It's one of the great things about being an English barrister, being a member of the English bar, is we've got incredibly strict rules about what we can do. I'm not a politician. I'm not involved in politics. I'm a barrister, and I follow my rules absolutely strictly.
And do you feel that as a member of the legal profession here, you are safe and free from attack and free from politicisation? Because, we've been talking about what's happening in the US, where Trump has gone after commercial law firms, people who, represented Stormy Daniels or represented clients in cases against him. I mean, do you feel that the judiciary here is under attack still, after the sort of enemies of the people time of, when Liz Truss famously was the
judiciary has been under attack in the past, occasionally by a few individuals who ought to have known better, including an Attorney General who ought to have known better. But I just feel so proud to be a lawyer in the United Kingdom. I mean, we really do feel safe. We are independent. Our independence is respected. Fine if political people want to have a go at you for doing a particular case or what. That's part of freedom of expression. I've got no problem with that. They're free to do that. I've never been attacked. I've acted, for the interests of the UK. I'm very involved in advising the government of Ukraine on Ukrainian issues, which, the British government is absolutely supportive of. Sometimes you're with the UK, sometimes you're against the UK, but never once have I, or actually anyone I've ever known as a barrister working in that way, ever been attacked. And that's really what is so troubling about the idea of a law firm or a lawyer being attacked because one of their colleagues represented an interest that a president or a politician didn't like. One of my colleagues at the English bar is a member of a chambers that has been sanctioned by the Chinese government, the entire chambers, for doing a legal opinion in relation to allegations about the treatment of the Uyghur community in China. So that's what China does. We've now got the United States doing exactly the same thing. And I think one of the things that's going to be particularly important going forward in this country on issues of Ukraine, on issues of how we deal with the United States. And, I'm married to an American who has always said the special relationship is a one-way relationship. She says she only heard of the special relationship when she moved to the UK. No one there thinks about a special relationship. We're going to have to deal now with our relationship with the United States, and that's complex. And I really think that issue, Ukraine, and the state of the world right now is one that calls for cross-party support, for sensible people across the spectrum to say, hang on a second, we are approaching a really dangerous and difficult time. This is not the time for cheap political points. This is the time to really ask ourselves the questions, what are our values, what are our principles, and how do we go about protecting them? And that's what I'm committed to in a system. And I think right now, interestingly, the sort of disappearance of the United States from the Western alliance, because that's what's happened. It's gone. It's completely gone. We've seen what they think about Europeans. Britain has a remarkable opportunity here. And I think the Prime Minister has actually done pretty well in positioning Britain in a way to act as an intermediary at a very difficult time. And I actually see this as a moment where, after years of being sort of on the margins, the United Kingdom actually, with its commitment to sort of the rule of law and international organisation and relations with the Commonwealth, with the Global South, with Europe, with the United States, has a really useful and important role to play. And I think that's something that across the spectrum a lot of people are recognising.
Philippe Sands, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, tomorrow, in case you've forgotten, is Liberation Day Eve. One more sleep, everyone. Just to put that in English, it's the day before Trump's tariffs come in. And no one is putting money on whether they will actually happen or whether they'll just fade away, as Trump's plans often seem to. But we'll be hearing from a former colleague of the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney at the Bank of England, Andy Haldane.
Trump's favourite word in the English language isn't tariff. It's a different T word, and that T word is Trump. So anything that rocks too much the boat for him, which would be cratering of the economy, tanking of the stock market, I think would begin to resonate.
All that to come. We'll see you then. Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.